This middle-aged woman has just crossed paths with a young man who looks and even acts exactly like her first love. Now, she's obsessed with the young man, and she is willing to give him whatever he wants just to be with him until things take an unexpected turn. Louise Harrington is a confident woman in her late 30s, and she is currently serving as the director of admissions at the Arts University. Her career is steady and successful, but her personal life remains complicated. Since her divorce from Peter, she has lived in quiet emotional limbo, even though the two maintain a cordial relationship, and they meet occasionally for lunch. During one such meeting, Peter mentions seeing her younger brother, Sammy. That is when Louise warns Pete to be careful around him, especially with Sammy's history of addiction. Later, Louise receives a call from her friend Missy, who is a wealthy woman that is currently trapped in a marriage with a husband who doesn't love her. So, she had sought out help for herself, as she tells Louise that she recently traveled alone to Florida, and that she had an extramarital affair with a younger man. In the end, their conversation leaves Louise even more aware of her own loneliness. The following day at work, Louise was reviewing applications for a student assistant position when one name made her stop. The name was Scott. The name isn't just familiar, it holds deep personal memories. As we later find out that Scott was the name of her high school boyfriend, who had tragically died several years ago. Overcome with curiosity, she calls the applicant and schedules an interview after requesting that he brings his portfolio along. That evening, Louise visits her family home, and while she is looking through old boxes in her childhood bedroom, she discovers a sketch of the original Scott, and this eventually triggers a flood of memories. Later on, she asks her mother about his family and learns that they eventually relocated to Florida. The next morning, she prepares for the interview with a sense of anticipation as she waits for the arrival of Scott. But the scheduled time comes and goes, without seeing the applicant. Confused, she calls Missy, and as she mentions the name, Missy reacts immediately as she reminds her that Scott has been dead for over 20 years. Then suddenly, a young man walks into her office. When he introduces himself as Scott, Louise immediately notices his striking resemblance to her late boyfriend. Then, he hands over his portfolio, filled with art that matches her own tastes perfectly. Although Louise tries to maintain a professional demeanor, inside her, she's unsettled by the striking resemblance and their shared artistic preferences. And when they talk, the atmosphere grows more charged. However, they are soon interrupted when Peter unexpectedly arrives and invites Louise to dinner. But she quickly declines Peter's invitation, claiming that she's busy. At that moment, Scott excuses himself, but Louise, still unable to shake her curiosity, quickly rushes after him and eventually suggests that they continue their conversation elsewhere. In the end, the two found themselves at Louise's apartment. Inside, the atmosphere becomes tense once more, and when Louise offers him wine, her nervousness is evident. Their discussion soon returns to art. However, the dynamic shifts when Scott asks if she's ever posed for a sketch before. Louise admits she has done it once. However, Scott proposes doing it again, this time for him. Flattered and caught in the moment, Louise agrees. And what begins as playful chat between the two soon turns to a charged, intimate encounter as Louise surrenders to the pull between them, and they end up having an intimate moment. In the end, Scott confesses that he didn't expect such energy from her and even tells her that she's far from the stereotype of women her age that he had expected. Before leaving, Scott suggests that they should meet again, and this clearly pleased Louise as her mood brightened up. Then moments later, Scott asks to borrow her phone to call his mother, and after calling, he casually asks to use her shower, even requesting a towel. Although Louise finds his unguarded behavior slightly reckless, she considered it strangely appealing. The following day, Louise receives another call from Missy, who is still living without restraint and tells her about her latest romantic escapades. She even encourages Louise to follow her lead, but Louise decides to keep her connection with Scott private, as she insists that she's focused on her work. Later on that day, Louise visits Peter's art class, and the very moment he sees her, he notices a change in her. He tells her that it is like a glow suggesting that something or someone has brought new excitement into her life. They share a familiar conversation, with the remnants of their old chemistry lingering, and she ends up inviting him to her apartment for drinks. Once there, Peter reveals a painful truth to her as he confesses that he has been battling a long-standing addiction to sex and that he has been with over 1,000 people, including someone Louise never imagined, her own brother, Sammy. The revelation shocks her deeply as she tells him that although she had believed their marriage suffered from a lack of intimacy, she never realized it was just misdirected somewhere else. When Peter insists he never wanted to hurt her and that his compulsion was a struggle beyond his control, Louise asks him to leave. Days pass, and the heaviness of that conversation lingers in her head. Then Scott visits her one day, and he notices that she looks emotionally drained. That is when she confides in him that Peter has deeply hurt her, though she spares him the full details. Scott, wanting to comfort her, assures her he would never treat her that way, and in a moment of reassurance, he admits that he's falling in love with her. Still vulnerable and longing for something hopeful, Louise allows herself to be swept away by Scott's charm, and that evening, he takes her to dinner. While there, he tries to convince her that he would do anything to restore her happiness, and their emotions quickly take over as they share a kiss. But the moment is disrupted when Scott's friend, Ricky, approaches their table and casually reveals that Scott had recently dumped another woman just 2 weeks earlier. The revelation unsettles Louise a bit, though Scott quickly masks any discomfort and diverts the talk as he leads her to a separate room and confesses his deep feelings for her. Suddenly, he starts to reveal deep knowledge about Louise's life, even mentioning personal details about Missy. The information hits Louise strangely as she remembers that Missy had recently spoken about a younger man she met during her trip. This made Louise start connecting the pieces, but when she questions it, Scott insists that his fascination with Missy was only an extension of his obsession with Louise. Eventually, they return back to her apartment, where Louise changes her mood and tells Scott to look at his reflection in the mirror. Then she urges him to think about the fleeting nature of youth and beauty, just as love can fade with time. She then places a tie around his neck, as she hopes to see an image of the man she once wished her ex-husband had been. For a brief moment, Scott appears touched, but instead of embracing her sentiment, he admits that he feels undeserving of her love. Despite the heaviness of these confessions, the night ends with them together once again. But by morning, Scott is gone. No message, no explanation. The abrupt disappearance shatters Louise once more, and while seeking for comfort, she turns to her mother's house to cry in her arms. Broken and feeling vulnerable, she confesses her growing belief that she cannot trust men. Neither Peter, nor Scott, nor even her own brother. Eventually, she becomes determined to get answers to her questions, and she confronts Sammy about his past with Peter. He responds bluntly as he claims that her absence in his life drove him to seek comfort elsewhere, and that he had become an emotional outlet for Peter. Then he turns the criticism back on her, accusing her of chasing unrealistic fantasies while life passes by. That is when he referred to Missy as someone who is living unapologetically in the present, and that he knows that she's currently been involved with a younger man at a nearby hotel. The implication ignites Louise's suspicion once more as she asks Sammy for the hotel's location. She then rushes there to confront Missy directly. She demands to know where Scott is, but Missy remains composed, and even offers a detached remark about how age gaps mixed with heightened emotions can lead to messy situations. Louise, who is not ready for a lecture, accuses her of being with Scott. That is when Missy clarifies that her younger companion was actually Ricky. But then she casually adds that Scott had once sketched a portrait of her without clothes. The comment lands heavily on Louise, and she is deeply disappointed. And on her way home, Louise unexpectedly crosses paths with Scott. The anger she has been holding back spills over, and she confronts him, as she demands answers to her questions. But Scott urges her to remain calm, as he tells her that it would be better to resolve their differences in a conversation. That is when Louise tells him everything, about her high school boyfriend who looked exactly like him, about the sketch she kept for years, the heartbreak she never recovered from, and how his uncanny resemblance had drawn her in. Scott listens quietly before telling her that she needs to let go of the past. His words hit her like a dismissal, and Louise reacts sharply, as she starts accusing him of brushing aside her pain and reducing her experiences to emotional baggage. In response, Scott's expression turns cold, and seeing no reason to engage any further with her, he decides to walk away. Back at her apartment, she finds Peter waiting for her. They exchange no words, only a heavy silence between two people bound by their past. The next morning, Scott arrives at her apartment unannounced, and the tension quickly escalates when he spots Peter inside. And the encounter that begins as a stare-down quickly turns into a verbal confrontation as Scott accuses Peter of being the source of Louise's pain. In the end, Peter is forced to leave, and even at this, Scott's frustration doesn't stop. He turns on Louise, accusing her of being intimate with Peter again. But she denies it, explaining that they only spent the night in the same place. That's when Scott tells her his own story about how he used to live without attachment, moving from one relationship to the next without guilt. Meeting her had disrupted that pattern, forcing him to reflect on himself, love, and purpose. And although falling for someone older had never been part of his plans, seeing Peter in her apartment made him feel replaced. Then, just before he leaves, he tells her that he's been sleeping with Missy. This immediately prompts Louise to meet Missy again, this time with the intention of getting answers rather than starting an argument. Missy doesn't hold back, as she tells her that Scott isn't coming back, and, even if he did, it would be for her. She then cuts deeper as she recalls their school days, reminding her how she always took the lead in relationships while Louise remained in the background, even in the case of Scott before his tragic passing. Then suddenly, Missy finally reveals the truth as she admits that she had orchestrated everything, from introducing Scott to deliberately provoking Louise's jealousy. Her choice of Scott had been intentional, as he reminded her of Louise's late boyfriend. She believed this resemblance might awaken Louise from years of emotional stagnation. But what began as a calculated plan had suddenly gone out of control when Scott developed genuine feelings, and this had pushed the scheme far beyond her intentions. This revelation sparks a turning point for Louise, and instead of clinging to the past, she begins focusing on herself, committing to improving herself and regaining her life back. She even ends every lingering connection with Peter, and when she tells him that their chapter is closed, he accepts it with quiet acknowledgement. Days later, Louise attends an art exhibition where Scott's emotional work is displayed. By then, he had secured the job at the university, and after receiving the letter of appointment, he thanked Louise. However, she reminds him that this was entirely his own achievement. There is no resentment between them, and as the film draws to a close, the two share one more kiss. They then part ways, at least for the time being. And that's the story of the movie, P.S. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us what you think about the movie. Until next time, stay safe.